In this video, we're going to take a look at Organic Studio's Nickel Teal. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. Honestly, this is a confusing color to look at. Sometimes it's much more blue leaning. Other times it looks much more green leaning. Now, if that's a thing that you go for, this is kind of a magic ink in that way. So needless to say, there is a ton of tone and color variation by pen and especially paper. It does sometimes shade, but just a little bit. You can coax a little more out of it with the right nib and paper, though, and we'll get to see that. Now, I don't go looking for shading here with this particular color. It's just because I don't tend to see a ton of it. It is a good ink. It just falls into a color group that isn't for me, so anything that might sound like a lack of enthusiasm for it is just simply that. I really do think this is a very interesting ink that a lot of people will enjoy quite a bit. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Retro 51 Tornado with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, you see that it's very light and kind of green leaning here. Looks very nice. It doesn't feather. It doesn't spread. It does actually shade. It's very hard to spot. And if you really look at, for instance, the word to, well, it's a little more obvious there. It's darker to lighter. But build, look at the subtle tone variations that happen. So when I first mentioned it doesn't shade a lot, that's because most times the tone variation is incredibly subtle and slight. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little darker and easier to read to me than it was with the fine. I really think this looks much better, but there's more good to come from this ink, so don't skip it all just yet. There's no feather. There's no spread. It shades a little better than it did with the fine. It shows itself a little more easily. The fine shading was so delicate and subtle, it was hard to find. Here, it stands out just a little bit more. Looking at the stub nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the medium, and way darker than it was with the fine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading quite a bit better than it did with either of those. It shows itself much better. Now, not to say that it's shading tons, but it's definitely there and showing much better. Look at before on the top line where it gets darker to lighter to darker at the end. Very nice. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Pilot Metropolitan with a fine nib, a Pilot Metropolitan with a medium nib, a Pilot Metropolitan with a 1.0 stub, The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the Clairfontaine and a little bit more of a green leaning. It's just slightly more. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading. It's not really a standout great tone on this paper in the way it's coming across. I don't think it's doing bad, but for me, this isn't really doing it. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the fine. We do get a tiny bit of feathering that's going on. Look at the D on immediately, on the LY with immediately. Look at that on the word that. So it does feather a bit more. There's the tiniest bit of spread. Both the feathering and spread, I think, are under control for what this paper is. It's not made for fountain pens. And it's not shading here, although you could nitpick a couple of darker spots. Looking at the stub nib, it is, again, just a tad bit darker than we had with the medium. I think while it does feather, I think it feathers a little less than the medium did. It doesn't seem to be spreading, and it doesn't seem to be shading. There's just this crossing of when the tone shifted a little bit darker, it became much more appealing to me than it did, say, back with the fine. Looking at the back of the page, you see that there was nothing that bled through and touched the page underneath. The ghosting, I think, is fairly under control. You could likely use the back of this page. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we expected some color shift based on the color of this paper, and it certainly was there. It's definitely now just a green, though kind of like a mint green. Its feathering's incredibly small. I can only spot a couple of tiny areas with it, and to be honest, if you're not seeing them, it's not worth it. It's not spreading, it's not shading, it's just there, a neat mint green. Looking at the medium nib, we have the same mint green, just a little bit darker than it was with the fine. It's got a couple of tiny feathers. Not a big deal. It's really doing incredibly well here. It's not spreading. I'm looking at it right next to the Clairfontaine. It's not shading. Now, there were spots where I went back over letters when I was crossing out betrothed, and it got a little darker, but not really shading here. Looking at the stub nib, that mint green got a little bit darker. It's got almost no feathers, almost none. Beautiful. Almost no spread. Beautiful. Almost no shading. I'll live with it knowing what's happened as a result of this paper. You kind of sabotage an ink sometimes when you use yellow papers in terms of its color. Looking at the back of the page, nothing bled through and touched the page underneath, but there is some ghosting. I do think you could use the back of this page without any kind of major issues. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a National Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, still holding on to that kind of mint green tone from the last paper. Just interesting, it's supposed to be a teal, but it's not so much teal. Odd. Anyway, no feather, no spread, no shading whatsoever. I do think it looks very nice on the page. I think it's gentle on the eyes to be reading, and so this actually could be a good note-taking pair right here. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone that we had with the fine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get no shading, but we do get a very good ink-to-paper combination. I think with either the fine or the medium nib, things are going really well with this ink on this paper. Then again, this ink on many papers is actually done fairly well. Looking at the stub nib, it's a bit darker than we had with the fine or the medium. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. There are a couple spots where some shading's happening, so it's doing fairly good on that. It's not shading a lot, like you can see it on the T's quite constantly, or when we get down to Frederick on the D and the K. The letter D and the letter K. Leave Frederick alone. Looking at the back of the page, you see that there is no problem when it comes to bleeding or ghosting. You can easily write back here. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Blackstone Blue Gum. Here is Diamine Teal. Here is Mont Blanc Blue Hour. Here is Pilot Peacock. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we're still on the much more green lean with the tone of this paper. We get no feather. We get no spread because this paper has been the sleeper to me. I really expected complete garbage and am in just complete shock. And I believe I mentioned it in the last review, but wow, this paper's been good. Is the ink shading here? There are a few darker spots, but nothing really stand out. Looking at the medium nib, it's maybe just a tad bit darker than it was with the fine, though largely it looks right about the same, just a tad bit darker. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, which we've really come to expect from this paper. It is shading better than it did with the fine, but not shading to where it's any kind of something you would go for with this. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the medium. It doesn't feather. It doesn't spread. It does have a little bit of shading. I think the shading actually showed up better on the medium than it did with the stub here, though some of the areas are just giving it. Now, more of you look for some really subtle tone variation, you will see it, but any kind of extreme shading is not really happening with this ink. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problems whatsoever. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here's an orange ink by Diamine, they're orange. Here is a purple ink by Diatramentis, they're Thomas Edison or black red. Here is a black ink by Monteverde, Midnight Black. Here is a red ink by Pen BBS, they're number 220 Watermelon Red. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, it's not quite the green that we were seeing on the last papers in the Steno books. It's more towards the very slightly blue lean that we had with the Clairfontaine. Really close in color to that, in fact. Now, this is feathering a little bit. It is spreading just a little bit. It's not shading. These are all the performances we expect from copy paper. Looking at the medium nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the fine, just the slightest bit darker, but not very much at all. Certainly a tad bit darker than we had with the medium on the Clairefontaine. Now, it is feathering, it is spreading. Neither of those are a shock. It is not shading. Again, not a shock. I'm really hoping this does not bleed through because in how it's doing, I think it's a very manageable ink on this paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is a bit darker than we had with the medium. It does feather a bit, and more in some areas than other, like you see it on highway and when. It's a lot. There's a lot of feathering here, okay? There's a little spread. Do I think that the feather and spread are out of control for this paper? No, I think you could manage dealing with it. It's just a matter of if you would want to. Now, it's not really shading, so that's good news worrying about bleed through. Looking at the back of the page, this did incredibly well. I think with the fine, you could write on the back of the page. So a real winner when it comes to using this with a fine, and nothing bled through to the other page. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? I found the dry fine was just a tad bit too light for my tastes, but my dry stub looked really good. It also brought out the most shading. It was really quite remarkable. So for me, I really do think that the drier stub is a great way to go, personally. However, I have to bring it back. If you write on copy paper and want to use this ink regularly, a dry fine did great, and you can use the both at both sides of the paper. It makes the dry fine on cheap copy paper the hands down winner. While I like the stub, the fine for copy papers. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did, do all that YouTubery stuff. Thanks for watching.